In the last church I served, DuPage Unitarian Universalist Church, there was a large group of Unitarian Universalists who formed an active Jewish heritage group. Now, each year they held a Hanukkah party and and then later a Passover Seder. And during each of these, they sang and they recited both traditional songs and readings, as well as more humanist, non-theist readings. I had latkes for the first time and at Hanukkah and gefilte fish at Passover. I learned about the hidden matzah. It's a half a piece of matzah that's broken in two during the beginning of the meal and hidden someplace, and kids can go find it. We played with dreidels, got chocolate Hanukkah coins, read about the plagues. You can see we actually had plush representations of the plagues that they handed out for us as we talked about the different plagues. And in addition to these events, members of the Jewish heritage group at the church and I co-created a Yom Kippur service every year for the church. And I have to tell you, each year I did that, I learned more about Jewish traditions and realized how this Jewish holy day might hold some meaning for Unitarian Universalists who did not hold a Jewish heritage. Now, before I tell you about what I learned, I want to tell you a joke that members of the Jewish heritage group told me about Yom Kippur. It goes like this. On Yom Kippur, a rabbi imagined he stood before God, and they had the following conversation. God said, "Have you studied all you should this year?" And the rabbi said, "No." "Have you prayed all you should?" The rabbi said, "No." "Have you done all the good deeds that you should?" The rabbi said, "No." And God proclaimed, "Well, you've told me the truth, and for the sake of truth, you will be forgiven." And my friends just thought that was hilarious. But to be honest, Yom Kippur is not just about being honest and being forgiven by their God. Although if you were someone outside the Jewish faith, it's easy to see it that way. There is an emphasis in the Jewish tradition on self-examination, on asking God for forgiveness for your misdeeds over the past year, and for God in His infinite mercy and loving kindness, patience, to forgive. But there is so much more about Yom Kippur that I think would be useful to Unitarian Universalists to think about. And so I want to share some of that wisdom that was shared with me by my members of the Jewish Heritage Group and some other people as well, because I think there's some things in there that I don't hear a lot about in Unitarian Universalism. Bev Becker was the head of this Jewish Heritage Group, and she would be the one at each of these services to get up and talk a little bit about what Yom Kippur was. Let me share a little bit of what she shared.
This is not only about the Jewish people and their God. During these 10 days of introspection between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, we look at our relationships with others, family, friends, neighbors, and any others we may have wronged or mistreated, and we ask for their forgiveness. And we, if asked, are ready to forgive them and perhaps reconcile. We ask them to forgive us, and they ask us to forgive them. Quite a concept. Think about it. Yom Kippur gives us time to reflect on the moral quality of our values and behavior. It is a chance to change behaviors we are not proud of and vow to be better people in the coming year. Yom Kippur marks a turning point, a turning from what was to what will be. Thus, it is written on a new page in our personal book of life. Others, like me, believe that it is our intentions that are sealed or set on a new course, that how we treat each other and ourselves, subsequently, the character we develop and possess takes place as a fluid process within our control.
Think about that for a moment. A fluid concept that's within our control. To look within ourselves, to look at our relationships, to decide to do something different. I think there's something there for Unitarian Universalists as they look at their own personal spiritual journey. But, as many Unitarian Universalists, I was like, well, that's, there's some really wonderful things there, but why do they talk about Jonah and the whale on Yom Kippur? I don't understand. And so I talked to some of the people in the Jewish Heritage Group, and they all gave me kind of different answers. And so I wasn't sure. So I went to a rabbi friend of mine, and he said, well, perhaps part of the problem you're having with the story is that you don't have the whole story. He said, first of all, here's the rest of the story. So Jonah gets spit up on dry land, right? And he decides, I'm going to go, because God forgave him, Yahweh forgave him, that he's going to go now to Nineveh, and he's going to preach about Yahweh to the people in Nineveh. And they heard what he said, and they turned their lives around. They asked for forgiveness, and they changed their behavior. And so what happens there is that there is a sense that they moved and God moved. God was going to smite them. God was going to do terrible things to them for their bad behavior. But God forgave them because they decided to turn themselves around, to ask for forgiveness and turn their behavior around. So I was thinking, okay, so how does the story of Jonah fit for Unitarian Universalists? Well, the rabbi and I talked a little bit, and he said, well, maybe this. Maybe think about the characters in the story. Listen to the story again, or read the story again, and think about the characters and how you might put yourself in each of the shoes of each of those characters, and what you might learn from that. Okay, well, maybe there's something there. So I thought about it, and I thought, okay, what characters are there? Well, there's a fisherman. Okay, they're on that boat. They're afraid. Boat's going back and forth in the storm. They want it to stop, and they're afraid. They look to blame somebody for their problems, and I wonder what responsibility they have to this, to the situation they find themselves in. And what about the people of Nineveh? If I put myself in their shoes? Well, recognizing that I've perhaps done something bad, choosing to say that I'm sorry and promising to do better, well, maybe there's something there for me to think about. And what about Yahweh? What if I was to put myself in the shoes of the God Yahweh? Watching someone that I love do something that's bad or harmful, wrong, being willing to forgive them, especially as they turn their behavior around, begin again in love. What about Jonah, the reluctant hero? Now maybe there's a time, if you think about this, I have, that maybe there's something out there that I need to do. Something big or scary or too hard or just something I plain just don't want to do. And so I don't do it. I turn away. Have you found yourself in a situation like that? Facing a problem, not wanting to deal with it, but eventually dealing with it? It's easier to do if you have people supporting you. I think of the people in all the Unitarian Universalist congregations I've served in, including this one. There are people here that will support me as I choose to do the right thing, even when it's hard, challenging, scary. So maybe there is something there for us as Unitarian Universalists. Maybe we can look at some of these traditional stories out of Judaism and think, maybe there's some insights that you might discover as you think about the story on your spiritual and ethical journey. I tend to look at these holidays, or holy days, like Yom Kippur, and I look at the things that stand out to me, like Jonah and the whale. There's one other that was really confusing to me. There's a song that's sung during Yom Kippur. It's called the Kol Nidre. Joseph's going to perform a little bit of it after the sermon is over today. Here's the translation of it. All vows and prohibitions and oaths and consecrations in any synonymous terms that we may vow or swear or consecrate or prohibit upon ourselves from the previous Day of Atonement until the Day of Atonement. In other words, our past promises. And from the Day of Atonement until the next Day of Atonement that will come for our benefit. In other words, any future promises that we make. Regarding all them, we repudiate them. All of them are undone, abandoned, canceled, null and void, not in force and not in effect. Our vows are no longer vows, our prohibitions no longer prohibitions, and our oaths no longer oaths. Why would the Jewish people sing that every year at Yom Kippur? Repudiating all past and future promises. It was confusing to me. I didn't understand it. So I went to a friend of mine in the Heritage Group. His name's Neil Lickman. And he explained it this way.
If you just heard me say, renounce both all the promises you made last year and all the promises you've already made for the next year and will make, you've gotten the gist of Kol Nidre. And you might be wondering, why would anyone chant that? How could this be an important part of Yom Kippur? It has been argued that it's an opening for Jews to take God off the hook for not having delivered his biblical promises to the Jews last year and giving him the okay to not do the same next year. Others argue that it relieves pressure to make a promise you can't deliver and removes guilt in failing to fulfill a future promise you don't have the capacity to deliver. My personal take on Kol Nidre agrees with that last thought and moves its meaning forward a little bit. You know what it's like when your body tells you you've made a false promise. When I've done this, I feel a slight stinging in my eyes and a lump in my stomach. I immediately condemn myself for not thinking fast enough to avoid that false promise. As time goes by, this eats away at me. Eventually, I do a miserable job of fulfilling the promise, or worm my way out of it. And what about a sincere promise that I make that I find out later that I do not have the knowledge, nor the financial wherewithal, nor the emotional commitment, nor any of the other resources needed to make good on that promise? To me, the message is twofold. One, if I'm pressured to make a promise, I need to get better at telling the person up front that I cannot make that promise you are asking of me. I do not want you to rely on it and then be disappointed later. In other words, I must take the pain of admitting this immediately rather than living with the pain of knowing I will not deliver over a stretch of time. 2, what about promises I want to keep? I feel I should condition the promise and state that if circumstances change to the point that I cannot keep the promise, I will inform the person of this at the earliest time possible. Kol Nidre allows us to reflect on a dimension of our character that starts out pleasing others, and maybe even ourselves, by making a promise, but also puts us in a space of character jeopardy that we might avoid upfront by deploying tougher character at the moment of making the promise.
As you can see, Yom Kippur is more than being honest and asking forgiveness from God. And I just touched on a few things, a few aspects of a very complex Jewish holiday. And I wonder, just over these few things that I've talked about, what are you going to take away from the service today? Are you considering doing a personal moral inventory and or confessing where you've come up short in your behavior or your promises? Are you thinking about being more honest with yourself, with those around you that you love, or your higher power, God, goddess, humanity, universe, creation? Are you reflecting on the work of forgiveness of yourself and others, and maybe reconciliation if possible? Are you thinking about what growing one's character means to you? In our Unitarian Universalist liturgical calendar, we have events like water communion, bridging, flower communion. We don't have a time on the Unitarian Universalist calendar for confession, forgiveness, doing a self-inventory, considering our promises. We don't really have any denominational wide rituals for things like this. However, we do have a fourth principle. We affirm and promote a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. But a principle, as noble and fine as it is not a ritual that grounds us in work, spiritual, ethical work. There's a call within this principle for us to consider how we might consider doing things like an inventory, or incorporating an admission where we came up short, or forgiving ourselves and others. And I wonder how that fourth principle might be expressed through ritual. How our faith might feel if we made a ritual for one of these kinds of things part of our faith tradition, a regular piece on our liturgical calendar. I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts. I'd be interested in actually co-creating with you a ritual that might help ground us in our Unitarian Universalist Jewish heritage, in addressing some of the spiritual issues that our heritage brings to the surface that might help us on our journey. I'd be happy to talk more. I hope you talk with me.